Let's turn to, I agree. Let's turn to a couple of pieces that you have up, and we'll start with the most recent first. One's at the Intercept, another one's at the New Republic. These are two things that I would say are in your wheelhouse after you talk about Highlights Magazine, and that would be banking regulations writ large and monopolies. I think, had spoken briefly, and I'm not sure if it was here or on Ring of Fire Radio, about the implications of the bill to, I guess, in some ways, begin to degrade Dodd-Frank. Just remind us what that bill did.
Right. Sure. So there's this bill, S-2155. It's often called the Crapo bill because Mike Crapo is the head of the Senate Banking Committee, and he co-authored it.
Pretty sure that's pronounced Crapo.
I think that's okay. I think that's not the only reason that people started calling it that. And the bill does unwind a number of regulations that were put in under the Dodd-Frank law, almost too numerous to count. It became sort of a Christmas tree with a bunch of ornaments of different little deregulatory measures, dozens of them within this bill. The idea is that it's supposed to help community banks and give them relief, but in reality, there are measures for virtually every type and size of financial institution. The biggest and most impactful measures affect what I call stadium banks, which are banks that aren't big enough to be maybe the biggest banks on Wall Street, but big enough to have a stadium named after them. And it certainly moves along the continuum of deregulating this industry that caused us so much pain only a decade ago.
And so the bill passes the Senate. It passes the House. It's about to pass.
Going to pass the House. Yeah, next Tuesday now, it seems, is the date that has been picked. There was some confusion as to whether Jed Hensarling, who's the head of the House Financial Services Committee, would allow this bill to be passed without more deregulation in it. He wanted other bills that he had shuttled through the committee to get attached to this, but finally he seems to have relented, and it looks like there will be a final vote on this in the House next week, and that's very likely to pass since Republicans are all for it. But I should say that in the Senate, where you needed Democratic support to get this done, 17 Senate Democrats out of the 49-member caucus voted for this bill.
Now, I have just coincidentally, I ran into two different people who worked at, and I can't remember the name of the bank, but it was one that issues U.S. bonds. It's a pretty vanilla bank as far as it goes. And I asked them about this legislation. And they both said, it's amazing to talk to people who work at banks about stuff like this, because they all go like, there's a vague, like, you don't really understand it. And it really is not that big of a deal. And I don't know why anybody's, and the real problem is blankety blank something else. And they both had almost the identical answer. They worked at the exact same bank, or I should say attitude and response, but their reasons were totally different. And I was amused by that, but there's already some unintended consequences, and ones that I suspect you thought were fairly predictable, though, that are happening despite the fact that the legislation is yet to the ink on the legislation is yet to dry. What are those consequences?
I would call them intended consequences. So the sort of justification that was given often by Senate Democrats as to why they need to pass this bill was that community banks are suffering, that they have this yoke of over-regulation on their backs. And if we don't do something, we're going to see more of these community banks go out of business, and we're going to see more mass consolidation in the industry. So this bill would prevent consolidation in the banking industry. That was the core point that was made by a lot of Senate Democrats, including John Tester. In truth, this bill will accelerate consolidation in the banking industry, and there's a very simple reason for that. The bill changes the threshold for enhanced regulatory standards from, it used to be that a bank that had $50 billion or more in assets would get these enhanced standards, which were very, intrusive and
more
now
scrutiny,
it raises
essentially.
More scrutiny because they're big banks and they might, their failure would cause a cascade throughout the industry. Now it's $250 billion. So all these banks who, were worried about going above that $50 billion level, now they have all this headroom. They don't have to worry about those enhanced standards until they get to $250 billion. So all of these banks at $40 billion, $30 billion, $20 billion, they don't have to worry about, they can scoop up as many small banks as they want, and they're not going to get dinged with higher regulations. So we're already seeing it. We're already seeing banks at that level buying up rivals in Wisconsin, in Florida, in Texas, all over the country. And I've talked to bank mergers and acquisitions lawyers, and they're saying, yes, the last 2 years were flat, but now we're seeing a lot of acceleration on the consolidation. And this is, as you said, before the bill is even passed, but knowledgeable that the bill will pass. There's a smaller threshold that gets raised in this bill through, I think it's Section 207 of the bill, that changes a threshold for a lower capital standard from $1 billion to $3 billion in assets. And most of these consolidations happen at that low level. It's a small community bank buying another small community bank to get bigger. Instead of having to grow organically, getting bigger through consolidation is much quicker, and it's a bigger, better path to growth. So that, raising that standard, we're seeing a lot of consolidations at that lower level as well. And what this ends up doing is, if you're a bank and you buy a rival that's in a small community, a smaller community bank, you're likely to move the headquarters out of that small community.
Right.
And you're likely to decrease your lending within that small community because you're trying to grow your business. And the way to grow your business is where the population is. And frankly, it's not really in that rural community. So the whole purpose of this bill
from the Democratic perspective, from the Democratic perspective,
the whole purpose of the bill to safeguard rural community lending is being undermined by the biggest provisions of the bill.
Yeah. Well, there you have it. I already hear those people from that bank like, well, that doesn't matter. I mean, so the whole idea of localization there is completely undermined by this.
And here's the most interesting part. So there's, this is a long-term trend. Since the 1980s, in 1985, there used to be like 15,000 banks overall in the United States, and now there are 5,600. This is a long-term trend, and Dodd-Frank did nothing to change it, and this bill might only accelerate it.
Right.
The one area where community banks are thriving is in North Dakota. And why are community banks thriving in North Dakota, where there are more community banks per capita than any other state in the United States?
Well, hold on. Let's ask Matt. He's from North Dakota. Matt, do you know why?
Is it the state bank?
Boom.
It's because of the state bank. There's a public bank, the Bank of North Dakota, which partners with community banks on these lending projects and ensures a good deal of economic activity for these banks. And Heidi Heitkamp, the Democratic senator from North Dakota, knows this because she lives there, and she voted for this bill. And she did not include, and she voted for this bill explicitly because she said there's this disaster happening with rural lending. But there's not a disaster happening in North Dakota with rural lending, and she could have brought that experience and principle to this bill, but she did not at all.
I think we should send Matt back to North Dakota and sit down with Heidi Heitkamp and explain to her what's going on with the banks in her own state. She apparently doesn't know.